The subcommittee on national parks, forests, and public lands will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 4 National Park Service bills. Under Committee Rule 4, subparagraph F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designee. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted in the electronic repository. The email address there is hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Without objection, Representative Robin Kelly of Illinois, Representative Darren LaHood of Illinois, and Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina, the majority whip, are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I want to first say thank you so much to everyone for being here today for this very important hearing on a series of very important bills. It'll be our first legislative hearing of this subcommittee for the 117th Congress. I'm very excited to get to work. I also want to start by thanking the sponsoring members of Congress, as well as our witnesses, for joining us today to speak to the personal and national significance of these proposals. As many of you know, this week is National Park Week, and I cannot think of a more fitting occasion to consider the slate of bills before us today. With 423 units across the country, national park sites preserve and share the stories of communities that have helped shape our country. Often billed as America's storyteller, the places we decide to protect and the stories that we choose to tell through our national parks are a reflection of our values as Americans. Unfortunately, these protected places have historically focused on preserving a narrow slice of American history, one that doesn't represent necessarily the diversity of our country's shared heritage. While we have made progress with recent designations, there remains much work to be done to ensure that our national parks reflect the diversity of our nation's history and its people. In the 116th Congress, under the leadership of then Chair and now Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, this subcommittee worked to elevate the stories of historically underrepresented and marginalized communities, and I certainly look forward to carrying on this commitment in my new role as chairman. Today, we will consider 4 proposals that seek to enhance and strengthen diversity and representation within the national park system. First, my friend and colleague, Representative Darren LaHood's bill shares the story of Frank McWhorter, a formerly enslaved pioneer who established the first town founded by an African-American man in the United States. We will also consider a bill from Representative Robin Kelly that would redesignate the Pullman National Monument, an incredibly important monument, as the National Historical Park. Established in 1867 as the country's first model industrial town, Pullman was the scene of the violent 1894 Pullman labor strike that led to the creation of Labor Day. And it has historical connections to the first all African-American union in the country, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. In 1937, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters negotiated a historic labor contract with the Pullman Company that led to better wages and increased protections for workers' rights. That contract marked the first major labor agreement between an African-American union and a corporation. It's considered one of the most important markers since Reconstruction towards African-American workforce representation and a model for other Black workers across the country. We will also hear about Majority Whip Clyburn's efforts to preserve historic sites that contributed to the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Although this case is often associated with Kansas, the Supreme Court decision compiled cases from 5 communities across the South, East, and Midwest seeking to desegregate schools. Inclusion of these historic schools would recognize their contributions to the end of separate but equal education in this country and allow the existing Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site to tell a more complete story of the fight for equitable education. we're grateful to the whip for bringing this legislation forward. Finally, we'll consider a bill that I am proud to lead here with my colleagues in the Colorado delegation in the House of Representatives, and that's the Amachi National Historic Site Act. My proposal would expand Asian American representation within the national park system by designating a Japanese incarceration site, internment camp, known as Amachi, as a National Historic Site. As we continue to confront the painful legacy of systemic racism in this country, it's critical that we honor and share the stories of those who came before us, ensuring that their fight against injustices and for equity are never forgotten. So I want to say thank you again to the sponsoring members and witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing your testimonies. And with that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Fulcher for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing today and look forward to working with you as you start your tenure as the chairman of this subcommittee. Today's bills are perfect examples of areas where we can set aside partisanship and focus on productive policy. And I look forward to trying to find other bipartisan areas of cooperation we can work on together. This week is National Parks Week, a week where we celebrate our parks and look to the future. Our national parks commemorate the triumphs and tragedies of our past and help us learn about the seminal events of our history, hopefully learn from them as well. The United States is and has been a country of many cultures, and our parks should reflect the uniqueness and diversity of our nation. I hope that as we discuss these bills, we can reflect on the current state of the national park system. We currently have 423 national park system units spanning more than 84 million acres. Congress recently provided $9.5 billion through the Great American Outdoors Act to address deferred maintenance at our national parks and public lands. And this is a time when the Park Service should be focusing on using the funds Congress provided to reduce its backlog, not adding new sites. Before I talk about the specifics of each piece of legislation, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we're missing one vital witness today, the National Park Service. NPS had ample time to prepare for this hearing and was able to provide written statements, which makes it even more perplexing why they couldn't provide a witness to answer questions, particularly in this virtual environment. Continuing to conduct hearings virtually and without administration witnesses is just no way to run a government. I hope we can return to normal soon in this committee and across the nation. However, I'm looking forward to hearing from the witnesses we do have here today. First, we'll discuss HRH 20, sponsored by our colleague from Illinois, Congressman LaHood. This bill would establish the New Philadelphia Historical Park as a unit of the National Park System. New Philadelphia in Illinois was founded in 1836 by Free Frank McWhorter. The site would help tell the incredible life story of Frank McWhorter, a man who was born into slavery and eventually purchased freedom for himself and his family. Next, we have H.R. 920, the Brown versus Board of Education Historical Site Act, sponsored by our colleague from South Carolina, Congressman Clyburn. This bill expands the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site currently located in Topeka, Kansas, to include additional sites in South Carolina, and establishes as affiliated areas sites in Virginia, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. This bill will help to recognize and preserve sites associated with Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, which resulted in the landmark Supreme Court ruling that racial segregation of children in public schools is unconstitutional. Next, we have H.R. 2497, the Amachi National Historic Site Act, offered by our distinguished subcommittee chairman, Mr. Neguse. This bill would establish the Amachi National Historic Site in Colorado as a unit of the national park system. During World War II, tens of thousands of Japanese Americans were forcibly moved from the West Coast to internment centers further inland, including my home state of Idaho. Amachi imprisoned over 7,000 residents of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens. We have the distinct honor of hearing from Dr. Robert Y. Fujigami as Amachi survivor, who later served our nation in the U.S. Navy during the Korean War, among a litany of other accomplishments. Finally, we'll hear testimony from the Pullman National Historic Park, sponsored by another colleague from Illinois, Representative Robin Kelly. This bill expands and redesignates the Pullman National Monument designated by President Obama in 2015. This bill is a prime example of why park units should be established for the open debate of the legislative process and not via executive fiat using the Antiquities Act. Instead of working with Congress to establish Pullman the right way, President Obama decided to go it alone, and now Congress must step in to fix the problem. I thank each of the witnesses for being with us today, and I look forward to hearing the testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher, for your partnership and your remarks. And now I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, for his opening remarks. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of our incredible chairman, Chairman Grijalva, of the full committee as well. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Goose, and congratulations on your new position as ranking member of the subcommittee. I look forward to getting to work with you this Congress on all the important pieces of legislation under the subcommittee's jurisdiction. I would also like to acknowledge that this is National Park Week. Each April, we celebrate our national parks and invite every American to get out and enjoy their parks. I'm fortunate and a little biased to say that I live in the best park in the entire system. It's located right in my hometown, Hot Springs National Park. Hot Springs National Park celebrated its 100th anniversary, and I know that we all look forward to the next century of visitors discovering everything Hot Springs has to offer. The National Park Service has long managed some of the most historic and scenic lands in America. Our national parks should reflect our nation's varied landscape as well as the diverse culture and experiences of our people. In recent years, the National Park Service has made a concerted effort to provide an honest look at American history and to ensure that our parks tell the stories of all Americans. I applaud the National Park Service for their efforts to make all Americans feel welcome and included in our park system. The bills before us today highlight important and difficult stories and lessons from our nation's past. It is important to acknowledge the blemishes from our history so that we do not repeat the same mistakes. One of the bills we are considering, Representative Clyburn's Brown versus Board of Education Historic Site Expansion Act, is of special significance to my home state of Arkansas. Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, now a National Historic Site, was the epicenter of the fight over school desegregation during the 1950s. Much like the bill before us, the Little Rock Central National Historic Site allows us to learn from the stories of those before us and reminds us about their struggles and sacrifices. Another bill we are considering, Chairman Negus's Amachi National Historic Site, would establish the Amachi National Historic Site in Granada, Colorado. Arkansas has a similar site, the Roar Japanese American Relocation Center. Similar to Amachi, the Roar site imprisoned tens of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II and has been largely forgotten in history. As Dr. Fushigami stated in his written testimony, when we bring attention to these important sites, we shine a light on our forgotten history and help tell a more complete story of America. I couldn't agree with that sentiment more and believe that stories like those of Dr. Fushigami and survivors of the Roar site in Arkansas need to be at the forefront of our discussions. I'd also like to highlight the Republican bill we are considering today, H.R. 820, sponsored by Congressman LaHood. This bill would establish the New Philadelphia Historical Park in Illinois. New Philadelphia was founded in 1836 by free Frank McWhorter and is the first known town to be founded by an African American in the United States. Frank McWhorter lived a truly incredible and inspiring life, and I look forward to hearing more about him and this site today from our witness, Mr. Philip Bradshaw. Lastly, the committee will also consider the Pullman National Historical Park Act, sponsored by Representative Robin Kelly. While the committee would have liked to hear testimony from the Park Service on all of the bills under consideration today, it would have been particularly beneficial to hear from the agency on this bill, considering that this piece of legislation is only necessary because President Obama designated this as a national monument through the Antiquities Act in 2015. With that, I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses who are here today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. Now I'd like to turn to our first panel and to welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills that they have sponsored. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. It'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the grid view or stack view so that they can pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I'd like to start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes to talk about H.R. 2497. I'm honored to speak about H.R. 4 2497, rather, the Amachi National Historic Site Act, a special piece of legislation, bipartisan, with my good colleague and friend, Representative Buck, that would designate the Amachi incarceration site in southeast Colorado as a National Historic Site. During the first months of World War II, the United States initiated the single largest forced imprisonment in its history. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued an executive order forcing more than 120,000 people, primarily of Japanese descent, to relocate to 10 remote military-style prisons. The Granada Relocation Center in the southeast corner of our state of Colorado, known as Amachi, was one of these 10 incarceration centers. 2/3 of the people at Amachi were American citizens. Most had never been to Japan. Many others were first-generation Japanese elders who had immigrated from Japan and were denied U.S. citizenship for decades. Most were given a week or less to dispose of everything they owned, with no idea where they were going or what would happen. The unjustifiable internment of Japanese Americans is no doubt one of the darkest scars in our country's history. It's also a deeply personal story and history for Colorado. While Amachi no longer holds prisoners, anti-Asian rhetoric continues in the United States. The recent surge of anti-Asian hate crimes is deeply troubling. As we work to address it, it's critical that we remember our nation's history so that we may honor, educate, and heal. Designation of Amachi as a National Historical Site will provide education for future generations on this time in our nation's history, as well as healing and honor to those that lived it. The landscapes, the cultural places, the stories that we choose to protect really reflect our values as a nation. And that's why the story of Amachi is so important. The committee is honored today to also be joined by someone who can share this story so personally. Bob Fuchigami was just 11 when his family was ordered to leave their home in less than 1 week with no explanation of their destination. He would spend 3 years wrongfully imprisoned with no hearing or trial. And yet, Bob went on to serve his country bravely in the United States military, and he continues to give back by leading the effort to protect the history of Amachi. I'm so grateful for his willingness to speak about a traumatic and painful experience for the benefit of the American people. His story, like many others, is told through the preservation of this site. Bob is an American. He's a Navy veteran. Like myself, he's a son of immigrants, and I'm so lucky to call someone so incredible a constituent. I'm proud that the Amachi National Historic Site Act, as I mentioned, is bipartisan. Thankful for Representative Ken Buck's partnership on this bill. I'm also very grateful to the Amachi Preservation Society and the Granada High School students who, along with the support of other organizations, currently maintain the physical site of Amachi. They've renovated the cemetery. They established an Amachi museum that I encourage everyone to visit, a research center. They restored key landmarks, including the water tower, a guard tower, a barrack. Their work has been so important, and this bill simply would not be possible without their investment in protecting the site. The bill enjoys local support from a variety of groups, including the Town of Granada, Prowers County, the Amachi Preserve Society, Mile High Japanese American Citizens League, the Anti-Defamation League for the Mountain States region, National Parks Conservation Association, History Colorado, the Japan American Society of Southern Colorado, and Canyons and Plains of Southeast Colorado. All in all, Amachi tells a very important story, and we stand ready to make sure that that story is protected and shared for many generations. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and to help us get this done. I now would like to recognize the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to discuss his bill.
Well, thank you, new Chairman Nagoose, and congratulations on your chairmanship, and I wish you much success. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody today. I also want to acknowledge and thank Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Westerman and Ranking Member Fulcher and all the members of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forest, and Public Lands for holding today's hearing and allowing me to testify on my bipartisan legislation, H.R. 820, the New Philadelphia National Historic Park Act. And I appreciate the comments from everybody that spoke previously on this. And I'm proud to represent Illinois' 18th District of Illinois, which encompasses 19 counties across central and west central Illinois. Our district in the state of Illinois, commonly referred to as the Land of Lincoln, is of course rich with history and heritage. And New Philadelphia completes central Illinois' 1800s freedom story. With anti-slavery writer Mark Twain to the west and Abraham Lincoln to the east, town founder Frank McWhorter embodies the central role that African Americans in their own freedom struggle played at this time. If enacted, my legislation would establish the New Philadelphia National Historical Park in the state of Illinois as a unit of the national park system. New Philadelphia is located in Pike County, Illinois, founded in 1836 by free Frank McWhorter. New Philadelphia is the first known town founded, platted, and legally registered by an African American prior to the Civil War in the United States. Over time, Frank McWhorter used his earnings to purchase 16 families out of slavery. Many African Americans and European Americans living in New Philadelphia later helped freedom seekers move north. The site has already been acknowledged for its historical significance. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is designated as a National Historic Landmark. The site is also included in the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program and the Smithsonian National Museum of American History displays many of its artifacts from the archaeological site. In 2009, in qualifying for its National Historic Landmark designation, the National Park Service cited, quote, for its high potential to yield information of major scientific importance to the understandings of free, multiracial, rural communities, and for the possibilities the town site possesses to affect theories, concepts, methods, and ideas in historical archaeology to the major degree. The site of this frontier community of African Americans and European Americans is a nationally significant archaeological site, advancing our understanding of free rural communities and the abolitionist movement in the antebellum era. The New Philadelphia Association has done a tremendous job improving, maintaining, and promoting the site for the benefit of those in the surrounding community and for those visiting the area. However, including New Philadelphia in the National Park Service system would provide certainty and ensure its continued preservation. The National Park Service can provide the tools, resources, and expertise necessary to elevate the site to its fullest potential. Including the New Philadelphia site as a unit of the National Park Service has strong bipartisan support in the 18th District and across the state of Illinois. I was proud that my legislation received endorsements from many local officials, community leaders, schools, businesses, religious institutions, and constituents. To highlight a few, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, New Philadelphia Association, Pike County Chamber of Commerce, Pike County Historical Society, Pike County Economic Development Corporation, the John Wood Community College, the Jacksonville Area Convention and Visitors Bureau, and the Pike Scott Farm Bureau, and also the Looking for Lincoln Association. I was also proud that the legislation received recognition and endorsement from several national organizations. To name a few, American Anthropology Association, the Society of Applied Anthropology, Society of American Archaeology, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It is imperative that we enlist sites like New Philadelphia with the National Park Service, and that they're preserved and protected for years to come, so that future generations may understand their important history as well as the lessons and history that they will provide. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative LaHood. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Majority Whip Clapper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, the ranking member, and other members of the committee who may be there that I may not be able to see. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I recognize the significance of the many programs and initiatives that fall within your jurisdiction. As someone who studies history every day, I am aware of the tremendously important positive impact this committee's work has on our nation's history. And I welcome this opportunity to testify in support of legislation I have introduced to provide a more robust, inclusive appreciation of the remarkable bravery that was led by those who integrated public schools in our system. Mr. Chairman, the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, was described by constitutional scholar Louis H. Pollock as, and I'm quoting him here, probably the most important American government act of any kind since the Emancipation Proclamation, end of quote. This decision transformed the United States, striking down the separate but equal doctrine established in Pleasant versus Ferguson in 1896. As you stated earlier, Mr. Chairman, the Brown v. Board of Education lawsuit was a combination of 5 separate cases. Briggs v. Elliott, the original case, was filed in Clarendon County, South Carolina, and provided the spark that ignited the movement for school desegregation. I grew up in the neighboring county of Sumter and had the privilege of knowing many of the plaintiffs in this case. And today, I honor several of them by displaying their photographs in my Canton office. And I was able to secure the Congressional Gold Medal for the lawsuit's namesakes, Harry and Eliza Briggs, and Reverend J.A. Lane, who organized the effort, and Mr. Levi Pearson, who really filed the original suit, which was Pearson v. Elliott. But because Mr. Pearson's property was bisected by the school board lines, and his house was outside of the line, the case was thrown out on a technicality. But Mr. Pearson lost. He kept his farm, but he couldn't sell anything off of it. The people around boycotted him, isolated him, and he paid a heavy price. And I was honored to include him along with the others whose lawsuits were successful. I know I only have 5 minutes, but I do believe it is important for us to recognize how extensive and how nationwide this effort was. In fact, if the people of Massachusetts were interested, there's a part of Massachusetts that should be brought in.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Just wanted to, I'm sorry, the people of Massachusetts, there's a site up there that could bring them into this case. But for those that are here in Virginia, in Washington, D.C., and in Delaware, along with Kansas, this is important for us to allow sites in these states to be brought in to this national effort. And with the next panel, you'll hear a little more about that. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to be here today, and now you're back.
Thank you, Whip Clyburn. Thank you. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentlewoman from Illinois, Mrs. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing as we celebrate National Park Week. It is my true honor to be here today before the subcommittee and share what Pullman means to the city of Chicago, the workers' rights and civil rights movements, and the history of African-American pioneers. You all may know the remarkable story of the Pullman community, a uniquely hardworking, problem-solving, innovative, inspirational, transformational treasure of Americana. The story began some 140 years ago, George Pullman built his factory and worker housing side by side on Chicago's South Side. America's burgeoning railroad industry needed better rail cars for passengers who for the first time ever were traveling across the country by train. For many years, Pullman set the standard by building state-of-the-art rail cars for American travelers. When those production workers and craftsmen began getting shortchanged, they held out for fair wages and unwittingly launched the American labor movement. When the luxurious rail cars needed a similar upgrade in their customer service, the workers of Pullman delivered by providing the best porters of the day. But once again, when those workers were being treated unfairly, they formed the first Black trade union in the country, and the International Brotherhood of Pullman Porters stood up for the rights of African American working men and women across the country. Pullman workers refused to waver in the struggle for civil rights. They stood strong in the face of deadly riots and ultimately forced Congress and the president to recognize the monumental contributions that working men and women were making every day. Indeed, these events in Pullman ultimately led to the creation of our Labor Day holiday, something which all Americans still celebrate each year on the first Monday in September. And while Pullman workers played pivotal roles and forced historic breakthroughs in workers and civil rights, that struggle continues this day. Their fight for fair wages and workplace safety continues in America. Pay disparity is still a reality in 2021. Civil rights workers' rights and voting rights are again under attack. But like the Pullman brothers and sisters who came before us, we will continue to stand up for hardworking families. A few decades back, when many felt Pullman had outlived its usefulness, some Chicago leaders proposed bulldozing the entire town. But as its history reflects, Pullman community leaders, and we'll hear from one today, and residents, descendants of rail car makers and porters alike, stood together, stood firm, and saved their neighborhood, their heritage, and thus the unique piece of American history. Pullman has also overcome its fair share of adversity, including the accidental fire that nearly destroyed much of the iconic clock tower building more than a decade ago. But again, the community united to rebuild the clock tower, which has stood watch over residents for more than a century. In 2014, Pullman finally earned the recognition that it long deserved. President Obama proclaimed Pullman to be a national monument. Today before you, we consider H.R. 2626, the Pullman National Historic Park Act, to elevate Pullman Monument to a National Historic Park. This will further efforts to protect, preserve, and promote this uniquely American site, its many historic achievements, and its multiple roles in promoting labor and civil rights. Throughout its long and glorious history, there's been one common thread to life in Pullman: unity in the face of all odds. This community's commitment, perseverance, innovation, humanity, and overriding sense of place, dating back 5 and 6 generations, forever shaped America. Oftentimes, stories like Pullman are overshadowed by other news from Chicagoland, but H.R. 2626 will shine a light on Chicago's unique, positive history as a confluence, a switchyard, you could say, of innovation, transportation, manufacturing, customer service, civil rights, and the labor history. Pullman is a national success story where a diverse group of local residents for more than a century repeatedly and sometimes painstakingly have always been able to overcome adversity through unity. It's a powerful story about America. I know for my constituents who reside in Pullman, this new designation will generate more opportunity for jobs and spur the local economy. Additionally, its location is near the proposed Obama Presidential Library and Museum, will help make Chicago's South Side a major tourist destination for all Americans. In short, elevating the Pullman National Monument to a Pullman National Historic Park will further preserve this community, honor the many compelling stories, and celebrate a place where adversity and diversity garner unity. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Kelly, for your very valuable testimony, and I want to thank all of the sponsoring members of Congress for their important testimony today. We will now transition to our second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have a 1 minute, when you have 1 minute remaining, and red when your time's expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise, and I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now first recognizes Mr. Bob Fujigami. In 1942, Bob and his family were evicted from their fruit and vegetable farm in Northern California and sent by train to the Merced Detention Center. Later that year, they were moved again to Amachi in the southeast plains of Colorado. At Amachi, the Fujigami family was incarcerated behind barbed wire for 3 years, during which time they lost everything. For decades, he has been an advocate for preserving and protecting the Amachi site, a mission that he dedicates to the Issei generation, his parents, whose source of struggle for survival in a hostile environment remains a lasting source of inspiration. It's an incredible honor to be able to hear from you today, sir, and you are now recognized for your oral remarks.
Good morning, Chairman Nagus, Ranking Member Fulcher, Subcommittee members, and distinguished guests. My name is Robert Bob Fujigami, and I live in Evergreen, Colorado. I'm 90 years old. I'm an Amachi survivor. I'm also a Navy veteran, joined in Greeley, Colorado, served in the Korean War, served for 4 years. 4 of my older brothers served in the Army during World War II. I'm a former educator, having taught students at the grade school, high school, and university levels. Incidentally, my university training was at the University of Illinois with the Institute for Research on Exceptional Children. My expertise was in special education. I taught at the University of Hawaii and the University of Oregon, as well as the Sonoma State University. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before you today in support of the Amachi National Historic Site Act, House Bill 2497. Thanks especially to Chairman Nagus and to Congressman Buck for leading this bipartisan bill. Amachi is a traumatic subject for me, very personal, and it has been for most of my life. I was only 11 years old in May 1942 when my family was ordered by the Army to leave our home and 20-acre combination fruit and vegetable farm in Yuba City, California. The time frame given us was less than 1 week. We were told to report to the local train depot with only what we could carry. No destination given, no reason given, except 2 vague words: military necessity. No charges were leveled against us. No trial, no hearings. We were loyal, patriotic, law-abiding citizens who had never done anything wrong. Why were we treated this way? Why were we singled out for eviction and incarceration? In Amachi, we were assigned to a flimsy military barrack that would be our home for the next 3 years. Each barrack had been cut into 6 rooms. Our family of 10 was given 2 rooms, each 20 by 20, Each room held 5 canvas cots, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, no running water, no toilets. The walls and windows were so poorly constructed, they left a gap, allowing dust and snow to blow in. Temperatures ranged from below 0 in winter to well above 100 degrees in summer. Dust storms were frequent. Mess halls, toilets, showers were communal. No privacy. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire fence, had 8 guard towers manned by military police. 24 hours a day, they had orders to shoot us if we tried to escape. While we were in Amachi, we lost everything we owned in California. We lost our home, our farm, our equipment, everything. Our time, over time, our sense of family, of purpose and future was destroyed. In Amachi, my mother had a stroke. My father broke his back when he fell down from a truck. Neither fully recovered. Even in the middle of this tragedy, all among the chaos and confusion, the people in Amachi created an entire town. It was the 10th largest town in Colorado in 1942. Despite the incarceration, 953 men and women from Amachi joined the military. 31 were killed in action, serving as part of the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Others served in the Pacific fighting the Japanese as cave flushers, military intelligence, and interpreters. Women from Amachi served in the Women's Army Corps. Now, returning to the site, even after all these years, is still very emotional. There's no substitute for experience in Amachi other than being at the actual site. Many foundations of the site are still preserved, allowing survivors and descendants to stand exactly where they once were forced to call home. A guard tower, a water tower, and replication of the original barrack has been painfully reconstructed. Local high school students at the Granada High School watch over the cemetery and help preserve the area. But they cannot stand alone. They need the National Park Service to help ensure this place is protected, preserved, and interpreted for future generations. A visitor center is needed to explain what happened to 7,500 Americans during wartime. This history should not be ignored, forgotten, or remain invisible. The Amache story is not over. Asians in America, including some of the most vulnerable, are still discriminated against, treated as invisible, and suffer from hate crimes to this day. designating Amachi a national park site would shine a light on our forgotten history and help tell a more complete story of America. Amachi is a collective story. It's an American story. I urge the committee and all of Congress to pass the Momachi National Historic Site Act as soon as possible. I've been waiting for this to happen for a long, long time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amachi. The chair now recognizes the distinguished whip, Bob Clyburn, for 30 seconds to introduce Ms. Leslie Canton, the Senior Field Officer for the National Trust of Historic Preservation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Leslie Canton, Senior Field Officer at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Ms. Canton has more than 20 years of professional experience in the historic preservation field and is a project manager for the Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site Expansion Act project. As project manager, she was responsible for visiting each of the communities represented in this legislation to conduct site visits and community outreach. She listened to site stewards as they discussed the importance of Brown v. Board of Education and its impact on their community. Thank you for being here with us today, Ms. Canton.
Ms. Cannon, you may begin your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Leslie Cannon, and I appreciate the opportunity to present the National Trust for Historic Preservation's testimony regarding H.R. 920, the Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site Expansion Act. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is a privately funded charitable, educational, and nonprofit organization chartered by Congress in 1949. Although most often associated with Topeka, Kansas, Brown v. Board was in fact a portfolio of court cases drawn from Kansas, South Carolina, Delaware, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. In 2018, the National Trust was honored to be invited by Majority Whip James E. Clyburn to explore the possibilities for preservation and protection of additional sites associated with Brown v. Board. Through the National Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, this multi-year effort has included extensive research, outreach to communities and their leaders, and collaboration with congressional staff to explore and draft legislative options. We enthusiastically endorse H.R. 920. This legislation would create National Park Service affiliated areas in Delaware, Virginia, and the District of Columbia for sites associated with Brown v. Board, and expand the national park's existing National Historic Site to include the related sites in South Carolina. This legislation is well supported by each of the site stewards and numerous others, as documented at the conclusion of my written testimony. As a result of our research and site visits, we determined the following. In each location, there are physical sites of high integrity and national significance meeting national park criteria. All sites are directly related to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. They want to have their stories amplified locally and nationally, and they are interested in being connected to each other's history. It is imperative to explore and share the triumphs and difficulties in the aftermath of Brown v. Board in interpretive efforts. All sites can benefit from connection to and assistance from the National Park Service. And the history is still very raw in many communities and must be approached sensitively. In Somerton, South Carolina, Black students were denied access to equal school facilities and to school buses. The associated sites are the former Scotts Branch High School and National Register listed former Somerton High School. There is a concern that Briggs v. Elliott and their part of the Brown v. Board legacy is not widely known, even by the children in their community. One community member recounted the integration was so painful and difficult for his older brother, he chose not to go to the integrated high school. In Farmville, Virginia, Prince Edward County Board of Supervisors closed their schools for 5 years rather than integrate denying an education to a generation of students. The associated site is the former Robert Russell Moton High School, a National Historic Landmark. There is still anger and pain from those who were denied an education. At the same time, there is pride in the history of the student-led massive resistance that led to Davis v. Prince Edward County case. In Delaware, Belton and Beulah v. Gephardt was the only case at the state level to be decided in favor of the plaintiffs. The associated sites are the former Claymont High School, the former Hockessin Colored School number 107, and the former Howard High School, a National Historic Landmark. In Wilmington, the Howard High School community and alumni are very proud of the facility and the education that was provided during segregation. There's a mixed memory about the results of Brown v. Board. Many indicate the transition was relatively painless. Former African-American students report the opposite. For them, the lack of violence did not mean it was a smooth transition. In Claymont, the history of Brown v. Board is less well known because Claymont was already integrated. In Hockessin, a parent made several attempts to convince the Delaware Department of Public Instruction to provide bus transportation for Black children. A bus for white children passed her house twice a day but would not pick up her daughter. In Washington, D.C., the decision in this case held federal government to the same standards of non-discrimination as the states. The associated site is John Philip Sousa Junior High School, a National Historic Landmark. This legislation gives us the opportunity to protect irreplaceable historic sites, uplift under-recognized stories, unlock the potential of these historic sites, and it allows us all the opportunity to invest in the future together in collaboration with our partners on the Hill and the National Park Service, as well as stewards and stakeholders of the historic places associated with Brown v. Board. For more information on the history of these places, cases, and its people, I can direct you to our ongoing webinar series on the sites that are part of this proposed legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now turn to Representative LaHood for 30 seconds to introduce Mr. Philip Bradshaw, President of the New Philadelphia Association.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse, and I am proud and honored to introduce my friend Phil Bradshaw and want to thank him for testifying at today's hearing on my bipartisan legislation, H.R. 820, the New Philadelphia National Historic Park Act. Phil is a third generation and lifelong farmer from Central Illinois. He lives in Griggsville. Even more impressive, he currently farms with his fourth and fifth generations of his family. Prior to farming, Phil graduated from Western Illinois University and served in the Army Reserves on active duty. Throughout his life, Phil has been active in politics and served as a valued advisor on agriculture policy. He was appointed and served on the Secretary Committee on Foreign Animal and Poultry Disease and on the United Soybean Board. Today, Phil serves as president of the board of directors of the New Philadelphia Association. Thank you again for lending your time and expertise today, Phil, and we look forward to your remarks on New Philadelphia.
Thank you. Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fletcher, members of the House Natural Resource Subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the views of New Philadelphia Association on H.R. 820, the New Philadelphia, Illinois National Historic Park Act. This important legislation will include New Philadelphia National Historic Landmark among the elite natural and cultural resources known as units of the National Park Service. New Philadelphia, as you heard earlier, is the first town in our nation platted and legally registered by African American. I want to take this opportunity to thank Congressman LaHood and the co-sponsors for sponsoring this legislation. Now may I take you back to 1817, when a man had been in bondage his entire life, had been a slave. He accumulated enough money that he purchased his pregnant wife's freedom. 2 years later, in 1819, he purchased his own freedom. Approximately 10 years later, he moved that family from Kentucky to Western Illinois, which is over 600 miles. A little township called Hadley Township in Pike County, Illinois. Another significant issue is it's only 22 miles east of Hannibal, Missouri, where they bought and sold African Americans on a regular basis. This is a story worth preserving. I want to also go ahead and tell you the rest of the story. Not only did he do that, he got 42 acres, subdivided. He had it surveyed, platted in the streets, alleys, blocks, and lots. Now, that's a pretty good story in itself for a man who didn't have a last name. Then he sold those lots to people to buy the freedom of the rest of his family. Interesting thing is, European Americans, white Americans, purchased more lots than the blacks in this remote area of town. It's a remarkable thing. It's a story that we need to preserve. It's one we have to preserve. It we believe is an amazing feat in itself, a black man to have done this. So that in itself is enough to keep the story going. But I think the true story here is the fact over 150 years ago, African Americans, European Americans lived together without any record of any hostilities toward each other. They worked together. That's an example we need to keep. I want to paraphrase the vice president of the Philadelphia Association, Gerald McWhorter. Gerald is the fifth generation descendant of Frank McWhorter. I want to just say what he's been saying. I paraphrase this a bit. If it is possible for black and white-skinned people to live in this small community before the Civil War, it has to be possible for us to live together in 2021 in peace and harmony. What a strong example to show people today and in the future of how people of different backgrounds, different skin color can live together. Better example is there than this. And I want to show you some of the facts that people have recognized this almost from its beginning. In 1837, the Illinois State Legislature passed a bill to give Frank McWhorter a last name. He had no surname. The legislature passed that bill, giving him a surname. And that was at the same time Abraham Lincoln was in the legislature. That's the purgatory to tell a story that needs to be told. Go on, let's move forward a little bit here. I want to preserve my time a little. If you look at this all the way along the line, people have been recognizing New Philadelphia as being special. You've already heard of a national landmark on the rest of it. What you didn't hear is this part of the Smithsonian. And also, you heard that the legislature had to pass. President Obama signed the study, authorization for the study. This was done. The thing that we want to tell you here today is this is an important part of history. It's a part we need to do. With less than 7% of the African Americans of the Park Services, monuments, parks, less than 7% of them are dedicated to African Americanism. There are always those people who say, we've managed it well, and I'm honored that they say that. The chairman, Lord, no, we're honored that they say we've managed it, done well within the last 25 years. But you know, I had my 82nd birthday last week. And my board members are close to my age. We have a 19-year-old girl that's just a dynamic young lady, so it won't go away, I assure you that. But you know that a volunteer organization just does not have the capacities, capabilities to handle it like the National Park Service. That's why we must get this listed in national. We must have it union in national. I want to stay within my time, and I see it's already going out. I kind of hear through this, but I would love to tell you more about it. We have a written statement. On front of that written statement we turned into the committee is a map showing how perfectly laid out New Philadelphia was in the 1830s. Amazing feat in itself. I ask that you pass this out. I ask you to support this legislation. And I ask that you tell your friends and neighbors that if it was possible for us all to live together in peace 150 years ago, we should be able to do it today. And had this story been told before the National Park Service and do other activities, might we not have less civil unrest today? We all look to the past, knowledge for today. Knowledge that we know people live together in peace and harmony 150, 170 years ago is an example we need to show out. That's why we need this site as a part of the National Park Service. I thank you for the time. I thank all of you who are here. I ask all of you on the committee, everybody seeing this, to support this movement. The United States needs this kind of story. Thank you, Congressman Lillard, for giving me the opportunity, and thank all the members of the committee for your support. Thank everybody in the Congress, House and Senate, and the President for passing.
Thank you, Mr. Bradshaw. The chair now recognizes Representative Kelly for 30 seconds to introduce Mr. Michael Schmanski, board member and past president of the historic Pullman Foundation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is a pleasure to introduce Mr. Mike Schmanski, a retired architect and urban planner and 54-year resident of the historic Pullman community in the 2nd Congressional District. Years ago, I met Mr. Schmanski, and at that very moment, he began to discuss the cultural significance of Pullman to the nation and the people that live there, and he has not stopped. Mr. Schmanski is a founding member and past president of the historic Pullman Foundation and vice president of the Dunes National Park Association. He is very knowledgeable and passionate about the educational value of Pullman's preservation and transition to a national park. I thank him for all of his contributions to Pullman and for testifying today before the committee, and look forward to his testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, members of the subcommittee, good afternoon. My name is Michael Schmanski. On behalf of the Pullman community and the thousands of people who over many years supported Pullman, its preservation, restoration, and establishment of National Historic Park, I proudly speak in support of H.R. 2626, the Pullman National Historical Park Act. During the past 50 years in various leadership roles, I've been directly involved in the efforts to preserve the historically significant Pullman community. As a graduate student in city and regional planning, I wrote my first paper on the architecture and urban planning significance of Pullman. But since then, my knowledge and understanding of Pullman's greater significance has continued to grow. Pullman is a place where, over a century, the Pullman Company designed and workers built railroad cars that moved America and established an international standard that defined luxury, comfort, and service around the world. The Pullman history tells rich layers stories of American opportunity, discrimination, industrial engineering, corporate power and relationship to factory workers, new immigrants, formerly enslaved people and their descendants, the beginning of the civil rights movement, strikes, collective bargaining, and the role of government oversight. The national significance of the town of Pullman has been well established and recognized by scholars and authors. In 1971, Secretary of Interior Rogers C. Morton, B. Morton, designated Pullman a National Historic Landmark. In 2015, by Executive Order number 9233, the Pullman National Monument was established as a unit of the National Park System with directions from the Park Service to preserve the historic resource, interpret the industrial history and labor struggles and achievements associated with the Pullman Company, including the rise and role of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and interpret the history of urban planning and design, of which the planned company town of Pullman is nationally significant example. The bill before you redesignates the Pullman National Monument as the Pullman National Historical Park. The bill incorporates the provisions of the executive order and provides new tools for the National Park Service to work more closely with partner groups within the Pullman neighborhood and adjacent neighborhoods to support collaborative programming to interpret history at the sites throughout the park boundary. The legislation will empower the Park Service to apply its expertise and deep knowledge to amplify local preservation efforts, and importantly, to provide expanded support, and assistance from the Park Service to help Pullman and the adjacent neighborhood draw more visitors to revitalize this area on Chicago's far south side. While the proposed legislation does not change the boundary of the park, it will give the Park Service the ability to acquire land and historic assets within the boundaries from those who are willing to donate or sell to the Park Service, ensuring significant structures within the park boundary will be protected and open to the public for years to come. Passage of this legislation will reinforce and permanently protect Pullman as a significant cultural resource of our nation. The Pullman stories overarch America's efforts to understand the economic drivers that have led to the conflict between labor, race, capital, and government. The powers and authority conferred on the National Park Service by this legislation will expand the ability to tell Pullman's unique and historically significant stories and provide a place where current and future generations can come to learn from the past and inspire ways to meet the unfulfilled promises of America in a just and equitable manner. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony in support of this important legislation.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable testimony, and thank you to all the witnesses for their testimony. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. As a reminder, we are also asking that members submit all questions to Mr. Fujigami in writing as questions for the record. I'd like to start by recognizing myself. However, I won't do so for the full 5 minutes because we have a number of members who are participating today, and I want to make sure that each member is able to ask their respective questions. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to each of the sponsors again for bringing forward this legislation, to all of the witnesses who testified, but in particular to my constituent, Mr. Fujigami, for his powerful testimony. And what an incredible life, Mr. Fujigami, you have lived, and the many contributions you have given to our country, your brave and courageous service in our armed forces, and your continued willingness to champion the legacy, the memory of Amachi, so that future generations can learn, understand, and honor what happened so many years ago. We are just so very grateful for your participation today. We consider ourselves fortunate to have had the opportunity to hear from you, and am just so grateful for all of your efforts over many years. And you certainly have my promise that we will do everything that it takes to get this bill signed into law by President Biden. But I appreciate, again, your testimony today. With that, I will yield the balance of my time, and we will turn it over to Ranking Member Fulcher if he has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do have a few questions. I echo the comments on Mr. Fujigami. It's just an inspiring story. It's a time where most of us obviously didn't have a chance to live through, but certainly appreciate the history and your contribution to our nation. So thank you. I have a question for Mr. Bradshaw. Mr. Bradshaw, Congress had passed a feasibility study for New Philadelphia in 2014. And it's been 7 years, obviously, and the Park Service still hasn't published any results on that study. In your opinion, what would some of the hurdles or difficulties be for NPS if they tried to add this to part of the park system?
Well, it's my understanding, and I've not had anything official on this, but it's my understanding that they have felt like we did a good job of managing it, that we raised several $1,000s. I think probably, if you count the archaeological services, archaeology project, over $1 million. They think it's been well preserved, the story's been told. And I think the other one is they look at the cost, and we have committed, I didn't say this in our statement, my oral statement, but in the written statement, we state that we will be donating the property. We don't have it all paid for yet, but we have it 75–80% paid for. We hope to raise enough money to pay for it all. And then we've also got a commitment from the superintendent, I believe it's called, the Lincoln Home, where they will be able to manage it. To Lincoln Home, it's Springfield, Illinois, it's about 65 miles away. They'll be able to manage. So the cost involved with it will be very limited at this time. So we think those are the two reasons they've been slow to put it out. I personally feel, and I think most people do feel, that the results of the study shows it's worthy of being a national park. But they just didn't know how to handle the finances and handle that part of it. And we hope we pretty well work that out. So
Okay. All right, thank you. And I know you, as a follow-up, I know you had addressed this a little bit, and I don't want to take a lot of time with it, but frankly, the audio was breaking up, so I didn't get a full understanding of your answer. But you've done an incredible job as a president of this association, and to preserve that site for future generations. And you were talking about another private organization versus the Park Service. Is it possible that another private organization can continue this, or is a Park Service really the best answer to managing the entity?
We believe it's the only one. What I was really referring to was our association, the New Philadelphia Association. Like I said in my statement there, I'm 82 years old, I'm a member of that age. And we just need a national association. We debated years ago whether to go with the national or go with the state. But this is a national issue. It was the only town incorporated, surveyed, registered by previous slave in the United States, not just Illinois or Pike County in the United States. But we do not know of any other organization will pick it up. It has the capacity to do it. So we think it should be part of the national.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Bradshaw. Just Mr. Chairman, if I can do a quick question, I think I got a little bit of time left to Mr. Schmanski regarding Pullman. Mr. Schmanski, the site was donated 2015 under the Obama administration, but it was just 3 years later that NPS reported had over 13 million worth of deferred maintenance. What accounts for that 13 million, and why wasn't that addressed prior to the acquisition by the federal government?
The efforts in Pullman have been multi-units of government and private philanthropy. There was the site that the state of Illinois controls is 13 acres. The national park federally owned land is 1/4 of an acre, which is the clock tower and administration building. The remediation was a state addressed problem, and it's been addressed. And over the years since the designation, there has been a $35 million investment co-chaired and shared equally by the federal government, the state of Illinois, and by the philanthropic community. It is a three-way support of this historic site. And it has been an excellent effort. And it has also been supported by the city of Chicago with external improvements to roadways, et cetera.
Thank you. So has that deferred maintenance, has that been picked up? Has that been taken care of?
Yes, it has. I mean, the site will have its grand opening on Labor Day weekend this year, a few months from now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm out of my time, so thank you for your answer. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher. I believe Ranking Member Westerman is still on the line. If so, yield to you for 5 minutes of questions.
I don't think he is on the line, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, okay. All right. Are there any other members of the subcommittee who are on? I believe there are a number of competing markups today, so I know some folks had to jump off. If so, if you could just let us know. Representative, I believe Representative Rosendale is on. Representative Rosendale, we'll turn it over to you if you have any questions.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Schmanski if he's still available.
Yes, I am.
Great. Mr. Schmanski, the Pullman National Monument was established in 2015 by President Obama, yet we're here today discussing changes to the site. Can you explain why the monument designation wasn't sufficient for protection and National Park Service management of the site.
Could you repeat the question, the last part of the question?
Sure. Can you explain why the monument designation wasn't sufficient for the protection and national park management of the site?
The designation as a National Historical Park gives the National Park Service the additional tools to more effectively complete its mission of preserving and maintaining the site. We tried for many years to have it designated as a national park facility, and legislation studies were introduced in 2013, and there was also legislation introduced in 2014. And the thing we were fortunate to have was the designation of it as a national monument under the Antiquities Act.
So I think basically this really summarizes the whole purpose for these hearings, and that is that monument designation is a prime example of why we should establish park units through the open debate of the legislative process. With the stroke of a pen, President Obama gave his hometown a park that obligated the National Park Service to maintain it in perpetuity. And this just isn't the way that things should be done. So I'm pleased that we're now going through the actual legislative process. Thank you, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Rosendale.
Thank you, Representative Rosendale. We'll now yield to Ranking Member Westerman if he is on for 5 minutes of questions. I believe his staff informed me.
Mr. Chairman, I believe he is on. I believe he is on his way.
Okay. Well, why don't we, I'll just give an opportunity. I know that we still have two of the sponsors of two of the pieces of legislation before us, Representative Kelly and our distinguished whip. If either have any questions for the witnesses, happy to entertain those. Mr. Whip.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I had a little bit of trouble unmuting here. I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the National Park Service, the work they've done on this particular project. As I said in my statement, you can imagine this effort started in the late 1940s, 1948, when Reverend J. DeLand began to organize the people over in Clarendon County. And the first person to file a lawsuit was Mr. Levi Pearson, who was a farmer there. Levi Pearson, of course, as I said earlier, the case was thrown out on technicality. And Harry and Eliza Briggs took the case up. And they were isolated from the community. They had to leave South Carolina. And they both came back to South Carolina. They came back around the year that I was running for Congress, 1992. And I got to know them. I knew of them before I got to know them. And their children and grandchildren, and the children and grandchildren of all the others who were involved, are very anxious about getting a place for their parents and others in history, the rightful place in history. And I think it would be a tremendous thing. I don't know if you know from the National Park Service, we recently established the Reconstruction Era National Park. But when we established a national park, we established it as a network, park and network, to allow other Reconstruction Era sites all around the country to be a part of that network and benefit from a relationship with the National Park Service. And that's why I think it's so important to allow these states to be brought into this network, because there's so much that these communities could benefit from, especially in a state like South Carolina, whose #1 industry is tourism. this would be a remarkable effort for these local rural communities. Farmville in Virginia, I've been there. I've talked to the people there. They are very anxious about this, where their school was closed for 5 years, as was testified to. And so I just want to say thank you to the National Park Service for all the work they're doing on this. And I hope that the committee will approve this legislation so that these communities can take their rightful place in the historical scheme of things. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Whip, for bringing forward this legislation. Incredibly meaningful. And if there's one common theme of today's hearing, for me, it's distinguished members like yourself, the witnesses we've heard from, all of whom have lived this history and are working so hard to ensure that it's protected and preserved so that future generations, my daughter's generation and her children's generation, can learn from it. So we're very appreciative of your leadership and of the other members today as well, Representative Kelly and Representative LaHood. With that, we will now yield to our ranking member, Westerman, for 5 minutes of questions. And then to Representative Kelly after that, if she has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to the witnesses. This has been a good conversation, a productive conversation. And Mr. Bradshaw, you mentioned in your testimony that less than 7% of our national parks are directly associated with African American history. In light of this statistic, how do you think the inclusion of the new Philadelphia town site would help the National Park Service more fully and cohesively tell the history and story of African Americans in this country?
Thank you, Congressman. I believe this is a story that is so timely right now because of the civil unrest we have seen over the last year or two. And if you look at whatever you do or I do, it's the fact that we look at the past or history of our country, the history of the development of our nation. We look at that for strength, encouragement to move forward. And I think this would help the National Park Service tell that true story of what went on in our history. And I think the National Park Service, with all its capabilities and its expertise, can do that much better than a private organization like the Philadelphia Association. And I just believe that as young people grow up, the chairman said a while ago, I think he said his daughter, as my grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow up, I want them to be able to go to New Philadelphia and look at it and say, here's what they did 150 years ago or 170 years ago, and say, we can do it today.
Thank you, Mr. Bradshaw. Ms. Cannon, my home state of Arkansas is home to the Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. And this memorializes the history and incredible bravery of the Little Rock Nine. The school is also still in use as an active high school. HR 920 would expand the Brown versus Board National Historic Site to include additional schools in South Carolina, Delaware, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. It is my understanding that several of these schools will also remain in use. My question to you is, can you discuss the challenges of including schools in the park system that are still being actively used?
Yes, thank you for your question. One of the main things that we heard from the different sites is the issue of how to deal with visitors. When you have an active school, how would they be able to actually do that, and how would they deal with the issue of security? And we actually looked at the Little Rock model as one that has an offsite visitors center that has very specific hours that visitors have to make an appointment to actually go to the school. So we felt like in discussing with the schools that there were definite options in terms of how they would be able to handle both being an affiliated area and also being a site that, being an active school and being a site that people wanted to come to. So mostly security and dealing with visitors during hours.
Yeah, and talking about telling that story at multiple sites, these sites are all geographically different. So what are the challenges of telling the full story in the history of Brown versus Board of Education when there are so many different sites in different states?
We actually think that that's a strength because it means that people can be in different parts of the country and learn about all parts of Brown v. Board at these different sites. And we actually looked at, there's an existing site, the Manhattan project, which has several different sites in 3 different states. And they have figured out how to do that. But in talking with these different sites, they really are starting to make connections to each other and figure out how at each site they can tell the full story, which actually gives people more of an opportunity to learn the full story in different parts of the country.
Congress recently provided $9.5 billion to help address the deferred maintenance backlog at our national parks and public lands. This bill proposes adding several new sites to our park system before that backlog is fully addressed. Would the inclusion of these sites add to the deferred maintenance backlog, and what are some of the costs of the Park Service associated with adding affiliated sites?
Sure. So with the sites in Delaware, Virginia, and DC, as those are affiliated areas, they would maintain ownership of those buildings and responsibility for the maintenance. So that would actually not add to the backlog. In regards to the 2 sites in South Carolina, they of course would become part of the National Park Service. But when we visited those buildings, they're actually in very good condition, as they're both being used by the school system currently as administrative offices in a community center. So I don't think that it will actually significantly contribute to the backlog in that way.
Thank you, Ms. Kane, and I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member, for your questions. Representative Kelly, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to give Mr. Schmanski, was there anything more that you wanted to get in that you couldn't get in the 5 minutes? But thank you again, and good to see you.
Thank you. I think the point that I wish to make is that this has been a shared effort for 50 years with historic designations by the federal government, the city of Chicago, and the state. And that the development of these facilities have included tremendous effort by the local residents to save buildings through philanthropic efforts. The Hotel Florence, several other properties in the district have been acquired. The Greenstone Church, etc., are all private facilities that help contribute to this. And it is a shared effort, as well as the efforts of the National A. Philip Randolph Pullman Porter's Museum, that has been a private effort to tell the stories, and each of these contribute to the program efforts that the National Park Service will be providing. So this is a broadly based, shared effort to preserve and interpret these nationally significant landmarks. And, you know, it's been 50 years that people have been working towards the idea of this being designated part of the national park system because of its many stories that really describe America's stories. Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schmanski, and thank you, Representative Kelly, for bringing forward such important legislation. And my apologies, I believe we also have Representative Gomer on the call. If he is available, I'm happy to yield to him for 5 minutes of questions. Just give him a few more seconds. Okay, well, we'll certainly ensure that every member, including Representative Gomer, have an opportunity to ask questions in writing, which they can certainly submit to the record. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony today, and to the members for their participation, their questions. The members of the committee, as I mentioned, may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll certainly ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. Again, I want to thank all the members of the committee for a very successful first legislative hearing for the 117th Congress of this particular subcommittee, a bipartisan hearing, and certainly echo the remarks of the ranking member, as well as with respect to the ranking member's comment of endeavoring to make sure that we receive testimony from the National Park Service in the future for these hearings, which we'll certainly try to do. With that, if there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.